Hello, Gothletts, and welcome to the second episode in the Ancient Egyptian series. In this episode, we are looking at Ra. Sounds like some kind of dance, doesn't it? Ra. But no, Re and Ra as one and the same. I will be mentioning some things which I covered in the first episode, so pop back and have a listen beforehand if you want to. If not, I will briefly go over them so you can listen to this as a standalone. Let's begin. So as always, grab yourself a drink, get a comfy spot, relax and enjoy. The information here has been taken from various online sources. If we have used direct quotes, you will find them in the comment section where you can find links, especially if it's a section of information. This is for entertainment and education purposes. Let's get that out there. And we'll get into it. So I've heard many different stories surrounding the Ra/Re creation. One is regarding Atum, and he was seen at one point in history like the major deity, the big guy on top. In the first episode, we did go on about how deities have changed and the ancient Egyptian religion was forever evolving as the years went on and more gods became prevalent and more took a backseat. So it said that Atum decided it was just time for creation to begin. It was time for life. And in the middle of some primordial water, an island came forth to support this divinity that Atum was. And this manifested itself into the form of Ra. I think it's important before we go further to understand that Ra or Re means sun. It's simple, and the sun to the ancient Egyptians, was this big circular fireball disc in the sky that gave them life. So it only makes sense, that they worshipped it. Re or Ra is often depicted with a sun disk above his head due to this, and it just emphasizes that fact. This is how they saw him. This was his identity. Ra did have many other names, but we'll go into that a bit later on in the text because it does get complicated and it needs breaking down. There is another mythological story of Ra's origin, and it's literally Ra just came to be being. He manifested himself to be. It's very simple, it doesn't need to be intricate. I will mention one more story, otherwise it kind of leaves a bit of a vague and ambiguous kind of void of how Ma'at came to be, and if you listen to the first episode you would hear about Ma'at. And it is another creation myth. So in this myth, Ra arose from the waters of Num, which is kind of like this chaotic realm. Think of a Pandora's box. And when Ra arose from these waters, Ma'at was created. And it's often considered that Ma'at is the daughter of Ra. There's also some talk that Ma'at was married to Thoth, the god of wisdom, who we briefly touched on previous episode as well. I did mention more about Ma'at in the first episode, so I'm not going to go any further into that. I thought this was worth mentioning, because if you'd listened to that, it didn't make sense not mentioning Ma'at. For the rest of the episode, I will be using Ra instead of Re, and use Ra also as an alternative for Atum, as well, as most of the information I found is very conflicted and very muddy about Ra and Atum being two separate entities. And I think it's possibly due to the evolution of the religion that makes it muddy. At one point, they may have been Ra a god and Atum a god, as two purely separate, deities. Or they might have been the same name for one, or they might have merged and been one in the same. So it just saves confusion. So we have Ra, Atum, Re, whoever, Ra for this purpose, who is the creator god. He's the main god up on top of the pantheon. And from Ra they came humans and other gods. Some of the creation myths, so it's said that Ra created a son, Shu, who is kind of an element, and a daughter, Tefnut. And they worked together to create basically that chaos of the universe. They created it all. And what family, doesn't have a bit of chaos going on? And we've spoken briefly again about family units and God relationships before. A lot of the theology that I have found has said that it was Ra who created humans from his tears and sweat. But then in others it says it's Shu and Tefnut that created humans from tears of happiness. And then they made the moon and gave the earth, and the sun. But again, this is all different myths, and they evolved. And you speak to one scholar and look at one writing and it has one way and timeline, and you look at another, and there's more. So we're going back to the 25th and the 24th century BC. Ra was the elite god there. He was that primary god. He was the most important god in the Egyptian religion. And although he was portrayed as the sun, he was mainly portrayed as the noonday high sun. So he was portrayed as I want to say epitaph, I don't know if that's right. The ultimate position the sun could be, high noon. And Ra ruled over the created world, the sky, the earth, and the underworld initially. It's also believed in some theology and mythology that Ra ruled as the first pharaoh of the ancient Egypt. He was the king of kings. During this time, Ra had several forms, and these forms do vary throughout all, the late kingdom, the early kingdom, new kingdom. They all change. We did mention in the previous episode that most Egyptian gods were anthropomorphic. With Ra, we have the human form, which is where Atum came from, so Atum isn't associated with any of the animal forms. Khepri was Ra in scarab beetle form, and the scarab beetle, or the Khepra, became a symbol of protection in ancient Egypt, and this was partially due to Ra's association with the animal, but also due to the ancient Egyptians' perception of the scarab beetle and its role in the world. With Khepri, was seen as the day form manifestation, the morning manifestation of Ra. We can also see Canum. I really hope I pronounce all of these names right, because there's a part where there's some really peculiar names I'm not used to mentioning. As the evening manifestation of Ra. And Canum merged with Ra is seen as a ram-headed god. We have one common depiction of Ra, is when he's combined with Horus, and this form gives him a human body and a falcon's head, and he becomes known as Ra Horikiti. I've probably pronounced that wrong. I really want to say Ra Horikiti. Let's go with Ra Horikiti, because that looks like it might be better. In the mythology, Ra Horikiti, the name basically translates to Ra, who is Horus of the Horizons, and Horikiti aspect of the name is relating to the sunrise orientation aspect of Horus. Again, a lot of the names they're given have symbolism behind them as well. It also can be seen that this manifestation of Ra is basically the symbolic part of Ra journeying from one horizon to the other horizon as the sun journeys, and it gives us some symbolism of hope and rebirth, and that's how the ancient Egyptians saw it. Ra Horikiti is also depicted in the Egyptian Book of the Dead of the Third Intermediate, and this is where those names come in, and I've got them wrote down, and I've got them so I can try and pronounce them properly as well. In the book, he is depicted on the throne of Nedjmet, Padakons, Nesta Betisuru, Jajang, the Jedken Aska Uskanken. That probably really is butchered, I apologise. Temenu, and in the Amduan papyrus inscribed for the Nesestet. There we go, I've got them out. And so he is depicted in different forms pertaining to different aspects of the religion. I do feel now would be a good time to mention the other merges and incarnations of Ra. Cults, as I mentioned in the previous episode, did adopt different animals and gods. So Ra, again with the cult, would be adopted with their animal and merged, for that own cult's representation. So here are some of the mergers of Ra and incarnations, and again these have evolved as attitudes to the theology evolved as well. So we do have Amun-Ra, and he's a member of the Ogdoad, and the Ogdoad in ancient Egyptian mythology were 8 primordial deities that were primarily worshipped in Hemophilius. I do hope I've pronounced that correctly as well. Amun-Ra appears in ancient Egypt as early as the 5th dynasty, and he appears in pyramid texts. Some do believe that Amun-Ra was invented by a Athenian ruler in the New Kingdom era, of obviously the worshippers of Amun, which you obviously know the cult of Ra around the 18th dynasty. Amun-Ra was sometimes depicted as a red-eyed man with a lion's head and ever present was this solid disc above as well. Next up in the Great God merging, we have Ra, Atum. These two gods were most alike in their attributes than Amun-Ra was. It's said that Amun was very closely linked with the sun as well, and in one portion of the religious theology, he was seen as the creator god of Atum. There were 9 Ened. Told you there's some words here I struggle with. Gods of Egypt, and these Ened gods were, the pinnacle, and they were Atum, Shu, Tefnut, we've already mentioned, Geb, Nut, Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. These were basically the children and the great-grandchildren of the sun gods, and it was like a lineage. So obviously we mentioned Shu and Tefnut before. I will say, if I do slow down my speech, it is because I'm trying to pronounce these correctly, and I'd rather slow down and sound a bit of a dick than totally butcher them going too fast. Atum and Ra, throughout ancient Egypt, was basically regarded the same. There was very similar deities and can be seen as one and the same in some parts, and I did mention this earlier. Throughout this and previously, you can see patterns between different aspects of the solar day with the manifestations of Ra, and this continues with Ra Montu. Montu is in theology a very ancient god, and he is the manifestation of the scorch effect of Ra of the sun, on the world. Now, there is also a possibility that Ra Montu and Ra Atum, that they symbolise 2 different kingships, one being of the Upper Egypt around Montu, and Ra Atum being of Lower Egypt. In theology, I have found that Montu had several consorts. The obviously consorts can be seen as wives, mistresses, companions, very close friendships of kingships. One of the consorts that Montu had is a female aspect of Ra, is Ra'et Tawi. Some Egyptian artists do portray Montu with a solar disc, 2 plumes and double urias, which are the rearing cobras that Ra has as well, with his sun disc. And again, this is that association with Ra. That does lead us nicely on to Ra'et Tawi. As I previously mentioned, it's the female aspect of Ra in the theology. I can find all these that have a minor cult following at some point. She didn't have much independent importance, being independent of Ra. So importance was always, it was linked. She wasn't like some of these gods I'm mentioning, could be an individual identity on their own. She was always linked with Ra. And again, the theology and myths say either she was Ra's wife, wife and consort of Montu, whatever is going on there, they can keep it there. But it's also seen as his daughter as well, and I think Ra'et Tawi being Ra's daughter, makes more sense, with her also being Montu's consort or wife. It also gets complex, and this is where family ties and links come in. And again, we've previously mentioned that, and I'm not going to go into great details because there's the whole lineage of the gods as well there. Ra did also merge with Osiris in the underworld, and Osiris, if you know, you know, is the god of the dead. I mean, I love Osiris and the complexity of everything surrounding him. Osiris is going to be saved for a future episode of the podcast. I will be doing a full one on Osiris. So we'll get into him in more detail. Then we might talk again a bit about Ra and his involvement. Other forms that Ra have been pictured as has been a full-bodied ram, beetles, phoenix, serpents, cats, herons, lions, bull, and basically any of the animal cults that wanted to adopt and merge with Ra, with any of the significant animals. While researching, I did find a description of Ra in human form. I will admit it's a bit stereotypical description of the images you generally see on papyri and on walls, but Ra is described as, quote, an aging king with golden flesh, silver burns, and hair of lapis lazuli, end quote. I just think it's nice. It does give that regal appearance, shimmering aspect to Ra. I thought I'd best include a couple of myths surrounding Ra. So here's one. Ra, being the sun god, had a solar day cycle. Ancient Egyptians used myths to explain the solar and lunar cycles for agriculture, for the day, to make sense of the world, basically. Ra travelled using two solar barques called Manjet, which is the boat of millions of years or morning boat. The other barque was called the Meseket, did I pronounce that right? Or evening boat. A barque is a sailing vessel with at least 3 masts. All the masts are rigged with square sails apart from the one on the stern, so the rear of the vessel. The sail at the stern is used for sailing purposes, just to give you an idea what I'm going on about that. So these vessels would take Ra on his journey. His journey would take him through the sky to the Duat. The Duat is another name for the Egyptian underworld. The Duat is also the 12 hours of night, which is seen as the literal underworld in ancient Egypt. So when it became night, that was their understanding of the underworld. You know, dark and bleak. And the stars in the sky with the gods and their ancestors. And again, that's a whole nother podcast for that aspect of things. Whilst Ra was on the Meseket, he travelled in his ram-headed form. In some myths I found that he travelled with other various deities, some of the main ones being Sia, being god of perception, and Hu, which is the deification of the first word spoken, and Heka, you know, which is magic, and a manifestation of that, what we've already mentioned in previous podcasts. Ra needed these deities to help him as Apophis, the god of chaos, his vets, you know. Imagine, if you will, a giant serpent. He would attempt to stop the Manjet's journey by consuming it or stopping the boat in its tracks by his hypnotic stare. That's, you know, what Ra had to fight. After all of this, the Meseket Ra would travel through the underworld and back to the east, ready for his rebirth, which is the sunrise. Again, this is how ancient Egyptians made sense of all of this. Another myth surrounding the creation myth I mentioned before has added that humankind plotted against Ra. Ra sent his eye. This was the goddess Sekhmet. Sekhmet was sent to punish the human rebellions because humankind was plotting and rising against Ra. So the eye of Ra are gods who are granted an extension of Ra's powers to use them primarily for punishment. Ra had several eyes of Ra, and his three daughters were seen as this. We have Bastet, Sekhmet, and Hathor. I do like the ancient, Egyptian kind of ethos that females are used by gods for vengeance. Yay, female power. And it's nice, you'll hear this, and gods and goddesses, although there's the main god, have this kind of balance almost in the ancient Egyptian religion, again, which I really do like, especially in a quite male dominated world. So here's a little more detail about the daughters of Ra. I think Bastet is the most known. Bastet was depicted as a cat, that black cat we see on all Egyptian artifacts, ancient Egyptians, she's there everywhere. And from personal experience, cats are a-holes. But she was known and shown to be gentle and nurturing. I wish mine was. Anyway, here's another story. Sekhmet is a female with the head of a lioness and the sole of disc above the head, that association with Ra. Sekhmet was quick to slaughter anyone who betrayed Ra, and this is probably due to the fact it said she was created by the fire of Ra's eye. Sekhmet's name has two meanings. One is the one who loves Ma'at, and she who is powerful. In her Sekhmet form, she was the goddess of the hot desert sun, plague, chaos, war, and healing. When Sekhmet became calm, she transformed into Hathor. Now, Sekhmet was someone you didn't want to mess with, and I know I wasn't going into other gods, but I did find another myth I absolutely loved. And at this point, I'm not sure if I'm going to do Sekhmet as a separate deity in this series. I may do. But remember I said she'd sent down to slaughter those humans? Well, she kind of wiped out the earth in one of these myths. And she was a bit out of control. So Ra and some other gods filled a lake with supposedly deer blood. It wasn't, it was ochre and beer. Sekhmet, happy to be, drink the blood and all of that gore, went to it, got a bit tipsy, and then was able to be controlled to come back to the gods, where she then calmed down. I just thought that was great. Let's get a woman drunk to control her. There's a few gods that Ra is credited to have created, and these are Ta, Isis, Apeg, and also Apophis, who we mentioned earlier. I also mentioned Atum as well in the first episode, that Ra is credited to have created. I will begin to end this podcast now, as I think you have a good idea of Ra and his importance in ancient Egyptian religion, and how he created different things. apologise for this being delayed. It's been a very busy week and finding quiet time to record this has been hard. Next week, I will look at Osiris, which I must say, as I said earlier, one of my favourite gods and has some great importance in ancient Egyptian religion. So thank you so much for joining me and listening to me drone on. As always, your support is extremely appreciated. To further support Dead Chatty, you can check out our link tree with all our social media accounts, and that will be in the descriptions. And we do have another podcast that I did mention, which is Trust Me, I Am a Goth, and that goes live on a Saturday night. So that is everything. Good night, my Gothletts.